Ladies and gentlemen, shall we start? It's a great pleasure to welcome you and to see so many of you. My name is Mark Jackson and I am Director of the Wellcome Centre for Cultures and Environmental Health. We started with the funding from the Wellcome Trust and the University back in April 2017, but we officially launched last February. We had a big launch, opening ceremony with various people, and we had our first external advisory board meeting. Every year, we ask a group of academics and other partners to come and tell us both what we're doing right and what we might be doing wrong, to advise us on the development of the research that we set out in the centre and think of new ways of doing things. This is our second, this next couple of days is our second external advisory board event. Tomorrow we have some formal dimensions of it. But each time we meet, we have a public lecture as well. Tonight, we are delighted to introduce Professor Manderson. I'll ask Steve Hinchliffe in a moment to say something about it. If there are people here who don't know about the centre, come and see us. There is a website that is glorious and will be more glorious soon, we hope. Yeah. But come and see us. We are located in Queen's Building in the East Wing or the West Wing of the East. Thank you very much. The East Wing. And come down and see us. The doors are largely open. The space is open. The feeling is welcoming. The atmosphere, the ethos is welcoming. So come and see us. Before I hand over to Steve, I just want to say another thing, and that is that these kinds of events take a lot of organising. The whole 3 days that we now have things going on has been not a logistical nightmare, but a challenge. Organising travel, complex travel and accommodation, and then the event. So I'd like to thank Lucy, Hodges and Rand and Mel Shaw for coordinating everything that's happening tonight and everything that will happen over the next 2 or 3 days. I'm going to ask Steve Hinchliffe, who is our Deputy Director for Research in the Centre, now to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Mark. As Mark said, the Centre is funded by Wellcome because they believe, and I think we do, that the social sciences and humanities should be leading questions as we move to think about health, welfare and well-being across our species and across the planet and so on. So it's really important that we're leading these kind of areas. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Lenore, who has been doing that for many years. And in fact, there's been inspiration to lots of us in the room. So I didn't have a long list of things to say about Lenore, but she kind of cut me short. So just say that I live in South Africa, Australia, and the US, and I work there as well. But I will say a bit more than that because she deserves it. She's a distinguished professor of public health and medical anthropology, and of course, most of you will probably know that she's known most for her role as a medical anthropology. I remember many years ago reading debates about anthropology in and of public health. You partly fermenting that kind of thing. And that's really important to our centre because we're trying to think about ways of doing research that aren't just on the world, but are part of it and engaging with the world. And so in many ways, Lenore's been inspirational for that repositioning of research to be doing research with those who matter and are affected by research rather than on them, if you like. So Lenore was really important to that. So she's best known as a medical anthropology. I should say that just to make you feel insufficient, as it does me anyway, she's edited 600 or written and edited 640 publications and various books and so on, which is pretty amazing. She's recently edited the Routledge Handbook of Medical Anthropology. She's known in medical anthropology for various books like Disclosure of Health and Illness, and also edits the Journal of Medical Anthropology. She's also a social historian, just to please Mark. So she's, I think one of your early works was Sickness and the State in Malaya from 1870 to 1940, so it has that element. In fact, I had a meeting with her this morning that she frightened me with her knowledge of the historical field, of which, as Mark well knows, I am completely ignorant. So, but anyway, that was a lesson for me. The really interesting thing, apart from all that, and really other interesting thing is Lenore's also an actor. And she's been between jobs, as actors say, for 29 years or something like that, but has recently taken to the stage again. And so, yeah, I mean, that's wonderful. But the other aspect of that, and I suppose this may come through some of the work, is that Lenore's also known and passionate about producing, curating, and being an activist in various elements, and all those kinds of elements of performance and so on come through both in her work and in some of the things she's going to talk to tonight. So she's turned her enviable skills and attention not only that interests, as you know, in medical anthropology, but also to something that we hold close to our hearts in the centre, to thinking about environment and its relation to health, to climate, and so on, which of course there's lots of work in this university, and that's where she's started to produce some of the work that she's going to talk to tonight. So tonight draws on this wealth of scholarly experience, but also her production and curatorial skills, I wish I hadn't decided to say that word, to ask how those environments, or how our environments, can be apprehended. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Lenore.
Just going to put this on. Sorry. I can't find the cursor. If you can just stick that little run on. We've been joking all afternoon that this always happens, and it. Oh, I see. I'm with you. Do you want to play? Yeah, I can play while I'm talking because then it will just go. So what I was playing beforehand was a piece that was the track of a video that was shown last year in both the US and then in South Africa as part of one of the programs that I produced. What you're listening to now is another work that was played in this space, which is a greenhouse above the building I work in the United States. And what you're listening to is actually not animals, but an analogue of animal-y kind of sounds on a 1960s synthesizer. And when you walked into the greenhouse, this is what you heard, and so it was wonderful. Okay, primarily, this is a visual lecture, but what I want to do is talk about the work of various artists and art science programs. But what I want to do first is to begin with this red text in order to tether the lecture to evolving ideas for a new written work. And I very much appreciate the opportunity to do this and to speak this evening. So thank you, particularly Steve and Lucy. In How Forests Think, Eduardo Kong argues the interconnections of species and things, not only of humans and non-human animals, but of the animate and inanimate world. The approach allows for the interconnection of biologies and materials in ways that acknowledge indigenous ontologies and local ecologies that do not privilege the human. It's an anthropological take on a Latourian turn to the world and its composition, which in some ways complicates the human centricity of the Anthropocene. A Western or global North now starting point in thinking of the planet as a containable, knowable mass of land and water surrounded by air. But Earth is a solid surface on which we build, walk, live and work, a resource to be exploited, but little more than this. Dominant modes of care are calibrated to reinforce Earth as materiality and substrata, stable and certain. In thinking of Earth, assumedly secure understandings of the nature, presence and behaviour of Earth materials are inextricably linked to their leasing, purchase, management and study. This approach is very different to local ontologies that emphasise the interconnections of things, of land with human and non-human bodies and spirits, of biological life and the elements, with humans nurtured by and having the responsibility to nurture. In his ethnography, Cohn is concerned to illustrate the interdependence of life forms and to highlight how people think of life in relation to other forms, magical, virtual and empirical, concrete and present. Likewise, Anna Singh in The Mushrooms at the End of the World on Matsusake mushrooms begins on the connection of and collaboration between species, and in doing this, she highlights destruction and species adaptation and questions of sustainability. Cohen and Singh have mapped new directions for anthropological work, an anthropology beyond the human. But as I will show, we weren't the first in this respect, and I'll come back to that momentarily. But Cohen and Singh and others following their lead focus on how we live with other life forms, with the elements playing a subtle role as backdrop and footing. Science research has often neutralised the human and centred on the bios as the constituent bit. And as I've noted, the boundaries are conventionally represented as certain and stable, even though we're increasingly bothered by the tangible unsettling of this premise. But scientists like Rockstrom and colleagues on planetary boundaries and Crutzen in defining the Anthropocene era have led a shift to radically question the known and especially the knowable near future. The work that I've been doing over the past 6 years particularly, especially has involved rethinking Earth and rethinking the Earth and other elements as an entry into environmental research and action. Part of my motivation in doing this has been to strengthen conversations across disciplinary boundaries. Part has been to apprehend the role of the arts, a wide field, to advocacy, research and action. It seems especially urgent now, as particularly powerful governments retreat from innovation and pay lip service only to ideas of sustainable development. Between 2017 and 2018, proving this point, news cover on climate change in the US, quantified, had halved. Thus, the urgency of maintaining conversations on environmental crises and climate change in different registers. And this is where art comes in. What I want to do firstly is start by emphasising the long tradition of conceptual art on the environment, and I want to begin with land art in the 1960s briefly, move on through this and just talk to a couple of pieces, and then go on to my curating. And as I said, that was the serious bit, and the rest is an opportunity to look at some photographs. The pieces that you're looking at, the work in the top, your top left-hand corner, oh, my top left-hand too, is land art by, well, that's Christo and Jean-Claude, and you would have recognised that, those of you who are familiar with it. This is done in Australia by Jean-Claude and Christo. The Wrapped Coast in Sydney, executed in 1968 to 69. And what's interesting is that the environmental activism movement and conceptual art as a broad field, and land art in particular, all came of age at the same time. So I think there's something very interesting that's happening at that time, coinciding, of course, with other kinds of radical movements at that moment. The work on the right top is the work, so Christo and Jean-Claude, just to sort of time that, were both born in 1935. So these are artists who were in their mid-30s at the time. The work at the top right is work by Robert Smithson, who arguably is the land artist of the US at the same time. That's the spiral jetty for the Great Lakes in Utah, which of course goes nowhere. And therefore has some relevance today if one wants to treat it as more than a structure in a lake. Smithson worked from 38 to 73 and in fact died of a plane crash on the way to do more work. And so that's his, the bottom left is by Nancy Holt, who only died in 2014, same age as Smithson, and married to him, and one of the few women who was doing land art at the time. So they're the Sun Tunnels. The bottom piece has been, notwithstanding, oh, sorry, I've worked out how to, I can't see it, is Andy Goldsworthy, who's from the UK. And that's just called Up Wall. Goldsworthy is much younger. He's my age. And is still doing that, very much younger. And is still doing this kind of exploratory conceptual art in the UK. So you're actually talking about, in that bite alone, about 20 years of work, although the heydays of land art was really about 68 to 78. You can imagine a lot of it was very expensive. But the tradition continues, and the piece of work that I'm showing you now is a woman called, oh, thank you, I did forget. Right, so now you can see this. This is the work, I'm sorry for the previous ones. This is work by Hanley Kutsia, who's a contemporary South African artist working with a woman called Sally Archibald, who's interested in, is a savanna ecologist in South Africa. And it's called Impala, I think, in Bantu, and what it's really around is the traditional burning of fire raising, eland and benko. And so the work was done to represent that tradition of making a new fields in the savannah. But of course it's an ephemeral piece, it's a performance piece of a sort, and once the burning is finished then there is nothing there. This was done in 2015, so it's much more recent. This piece is done even earlier, 2005, and is different because it's not just the land that is now being showcased, but humans inland. And Andrea Juan is an Argentinian who now lives in Spain. And for many years she had a fellowship with and spent time on the Argentinian military base. So she was linked with the Argentinian military base in Antarctica. And so this work was all done in the Antarctica. And what she was doing, as you can see there, is she was working with a dancer who was dressed, and the high winds of the Antarctic would sweep these huge trails of diaphanous material. They were photographed and videoed, and then she would take that and do installations. So this is someone who's shown in places such as the Museum of Modern Art in New York and the big Contemporary Art Museum in Brazil and so on. And she did a series called On Red and Blue in Antarctica for about 4 years, and was affiliated for longer, and there were others that involved projection. The next one that I want to show you is again one that I think will be familiar to many of you. This is Olafur Orgasm with Minik Rosin, called Ice Watch. This particular picture is stolen from the web of his work that was done at COP21 in Paris, the Conference of the Parties on Climate Change. And the Paris was particularly interesting because Cape Farewell, and I'll reference them again, under the leadership of David Buckland, sponsored a lot of artwork in and around Paris on the environment. Eliassen's work, I think, became one of the best known, and it is simply 12 ice blocks positioned in the shape of a clock, which melted over the time, demonstrating that time runs out at multiple levels. And I think the point of a lot of this work is that it is transitory, it is ephemeral, but I also think very powerful. This particular work was supported directly, directly by Cape Farewell. The next work is the work of an artist called Justin Bryce Gorelia, and I'll talk a little bit more about him, but what you're looking at there is a carbon tattoo on the skin of GIS, Global Temperature Anomalies 5-year mean. So NASA, Justin has worked with the NASA Institute for Space Studies, and he's travelled a lot with them. And this is the 5-year intervals data of the mean rise of temperature tattooed on his skin. For those of you who are familiar with art, artists always include things, including when the work was done, and what the work is involved, including the materials. So the description of this is a GIST temp index 1880 to 2015. So near his wrist is the 1880 temperature, and then as it rises, it goes around his arm through to 2016 when the tattoo was done. So the duration of the tattoo in this case is from 2016 to deceased, it says on the work of the art, using black carbon tattoo pigmentation. Justin has done a lot of other kinds of work, including a lot of filming. He's also a musician and someone that I did spend time with at Brown. His work is coming to London soon, 16th to 29th of April at Somerset House. And again, this is an installation which is really a message-bearing one. So we've got their global warming at work, and all of these signs keep changing with other sort of takeaway messages around the work. The next one I want to show you is work that was shown a few years ago, 2010, by the Royal Academy of Arts at Burlington Gardens. They have a new work, had a new work season from December 2009 to 2010. And this is by a contemporary artist called Manohar Tool. What the globe you're looking at is supposedly average human height and width. So I think it's by diameter about 170 centimetres, although it looks small in this, it's not a small thing. It took up a whole room. And her purpose in outlining the continents is around the ways in which inhabited land on Earth are burning up the planet. And it's called hotspot. And the point of the hotspot is indeed that there are hot spots of global warming, but all of the emissions are then reflected, and this sort of varied in how it was shown. So now this is all background in case you're wondering where I'm going. This work I've included not because, although it has been done as huge installations, but I've chosen it because this is the work of Margaret and Christine Wertheim, who are Australians working in Los Angeles and who run a project called the Crochet Coral Reef. And they've sort of franchised or brought in other crochet people around the world to also contribute to creating coral reefs. So it's become a very large piece of work, and there's some text that has gone with some of theirs around, after the revolution, who's going to pick up the garbage, that they cite from Malay Lederman Keris's manifesto from '69. So they're referencing earlier environmental work and referencing gender politics at the same time. And of course, the use of the crochet is clearly gendered in the same way, for example, that yarn bombing is gendered and related interventions like that. This is an Australian piece in Australia at the Centre for Contemporary Art in Melbourne by an artist called Lauren Berkowitz. This is much newer. This is the bottles from 2017. It's not directly about Earth, but the installation was as if a river, and all of this is waste bottles, and it was a huge thing, like the width of this room or more, focusing on waste and consumption and raising questions around recycling in ways I think that are especially interesting for Australia at the time when China refused to take our garbage, and Australia now has a problem of what to do with all the waste we were shipping offshore, which raises further questions about who's responsible for what. And some of you will know that Australia is one of the countries I was alluding to when I was reading that has backpedalled on the environment and is currently a particularly worrying conservative, has a particularly worrying conservative government. So this is the background, although some of it happened once I started working, and I began to be involved in the curatorial side of my work, but also more generally around environment through the work of Julie's Bicycle, which is a UK, most of you know Julie's Bicycle, so I won't talk too much about it, but Julie's Bicycle were doing tipping point interventions where they were bringing together a selection of academics and writers and artists and really doing 2-day workshops on a warming world and a world that's being trashed at the same time. And although I didn't care for all of the kind of games and stuff that some of these, immersive workshops involve, it was actually, extremely important. And I sort of immediately went from that idea to, how can one use art more so? Then I was involved in a not surprising, I suppose, unsuccessful application for funding to do some work that involved anthropologists, climatologists and artists across Argentina and South Africa and Australia. This is when I was still in Australia, where we were trying to get at migration and urbanisation and climate change in an area that is vaguely around 40 degrees south, which was the kind of heuristic that I was working with. Skipping forward, in 2014, I started working in both South Africa and in the US at Brown University. And whilst my work in South Africa largely drew on my day job as a medical anthropologist, my briefing at Brown was simply to bring together the art and humanities into the work of the Institute for Environment and Society, which was being seen to be dominated by hard scientists. And I have done that around curated events, 1 to 2 weeks on each occasion. And I just want to walk you through these as a way of raising questions too about how one gets those conversations going and then reflect on their impact. So the way I did it was to think through the elements, which explains my comments about the elements at the beginning of my address. So earth, air, fire, water. And in each case, I linked an element with an art practice. This year, in 3 weeks' time, is not an element. It's called, we can talk about it later if someone, but anyway. So the first 4 were earth, air, fire, water, and earth was coupled with dance. So it was the body as a whole. And the focus was on modes of knowing and on stewardship and the challenges of stewardship of earth and the earth. And the work was dance, and what you see there is the dance that I worked with a woman called Shura Baryshnikov, who is the daughter of a particularly well-known dancer. And Shura works with people who work in the field of contact improvisation. So it's a very embodied form of dance with a lot of, as you can see, lifting and working against another person. So even the dance form resonated with what we were doing intellectually when we were thinking of the earth. But she also did this on a very large sprung wood floor with pieces of wet clay that the dancers worked on and off, and it was called aftershock, a sampling effect. And so they're imprinting, and so the end of it is this sort of worn thin wet clay. And so the dance itself captured some of the issues that I wanted to bring up in the academic performances. Now, in that context, what I need to explain is that there was the art and there was the theme. And then what happened at each of these has been, firstly, a library exhibition. It's a John Carter Brown Library, which has the largest Americana and collection in the world. And so the director there curated with others an exhibition, first year on earth, then on air, then fire, then water. There were posters and flash lectures, which has been the way in which I've got students particularly involved and young scholars. There's been an evening film program, performances, including, I said, the first voice and music you heard was from a person who originally was doing live performances and then also did a video, keynote addresses, academic panels and sessions, and then other things. So, and one of the people who spoke in the first year was a man called Dan Nepstead, who has been responsible for reforestation programs in Latin America, particularly Brazil, in the Amazon. But in addition, the other keynote was a woman called, and you'll have to forgive me as I read this, Kukui, which is easy, Kelly Ikana Oleo Halelili. And she is a Haitian geographer and climatologist who uses GIS to map cultural sites and changes in the environment in Hawaii. But she is also a custodian of hula tradition. And her entire, this photograph is inside the John Carter Brown Library. Her entire lecture was done as a hula performance. And what you actually see is the August members of the Brown community hulaing their way to know the earth. And it was wonderful because these were people who, this is the first year and nobody knows what I'm going to do. And they really took a risk and it was just amazing, those resonances. The second year was air, and air, not even surprisingly, is sound and music. And the second piece I played while I was starting to talk on the analog synthesizer was included in that. So in addition to the film and the library exhibition and flash lectures and so on, there were 3 acoustic ecologists working and doing installations. There were a lot of students with installations. There was a smartphone app thing where you walked around the campus and played different rainforests. So to some extent there was a virtual rainforest on campus. The greenhouse, as I said, was sounded up, and there was bird walks and then the conventional academic things. And I mean, this pushed, you know, how the arts were related. And the acoustic ecologists, I think, are particularly interesting. They all come from arts backgrounds. They're not scientists by training. And they largely follow the work of Bernie Krause. Almost no one in this room will remember, but Bernie Krause was originally, for a while, played with the Beatles. And as in the John Paul Ringo Beatles. Anyway, and then with the Weavers, and then started doing massive work on acoustic ecology. And the point is, in what ways does sound shift what we see? I mean, or complement what is visible. And he originally did it because there was an argument that you could thin out a forest for wood rather than pull the forest down and nobody would know the difference. And what he did was track over a year the degradation of the environment and the loss of particular species to the environment because the density itself was important. And the fact that you looked and said, yeah, well, it looks the same, was not particularly significant. And so a number of these people have been doing that kind of acoustic ecology. And most acoustic ecologists, including those who are involved in an international organisation, are originally musicians or musical technicians. They're not trained, they don't approach this from ecology. The third year was what fire does, and my concern in that was to not tell a story of destruction alone, since human settlement was largely dependent on our capacity to harness the power of fire. And the way in which we did it was firstly that I was collaborating with RISD, and RISD has both a ceramics and a glass department. So I was interested in ceramics and glass as ways of transforming elemental and material things into usable things for human purpose. But it's around manufacturing, and it's around production, it's around transformation, and it's around destruction. And so one of the people involved is a person who, or there were people who were involved in wildfires and managing wildfires, but also because it was about manufacturing, it was a mechanism to look at the way in which manufacturing industry had trashed the environment, and that was particularly relevant to Providence, Rhode Island, which is where Brown is, because it was the birthplace of milling, and it had a very large jewellery, costume jewellery manufacturing industry post-World War II until China displaced that market. So a lot of toxins. So the Environmental Protection Agency and the Super Fund have always been interested in that area. The top image is a reception, and RISD, Rhode Island School of Design, has a thing called the Nature Lab, and I'll explain a bit more in a second. So the Nature Lab includes things for art students to learn to draw. So it's full of old taxidermy, and then the odd live snake and fish and crabs and so on, but taxidermied bears and taxidermied eagles and other kinds of critters, and then rocks and shells and everything else. So that became the reception, which I thought was, amongst other things, a great generous gesture from that university in collaboration. The bottom is a performance that the fire department, the glass department did, where they were making melting glass to make glass volcanoes, and then inserting different things in the glass to show the impact. If you dropped orange peel in a phenomenally hot glass volcano, you get a different effect than if you drop firecrackers or something down it. So then off the Nature Lab was the Osteology Lab, and this is David Katz, who did a work called Structure and Growth, where he was exploring the difference that fire makes. Remember, it's called What Fire Does, in terms of fired and unfired clay. So the fired are those jars that reference early forms that we find in archaeology across Europe. And although not decorated, just plain, but still that was the point. From that base, and you can sort of see the table, from that table, the jars are set in wet clay. So around the bottom of the jars is wood that you can see now, but it then gets covered with clay. And then from the jars are all these threads of steel around which you also put wet clay. Now, over time, what happens is that the wet clay cracks. The picture here does not show how the base cracked, but the base cracks beautifully. The fired clay, of course, does, but it holds its form and its functionality as a water collector thing. But the beauty of this particular shot from a mezzanine area or a gallery is, there are all of the skeletons looking on. And what happened with this tree, as it were, is that it became a place where people in the lab used to have their lunch, and you'd walk in and there'd be everyone sitting under the tree having their lunch. So it was really interesting in terms of how a piece of work that lasted, an installation that lasted for the duration, and What Fire Does did go on for 2 weeks. So in addition to this, we included, there was a wood fire kiln was lit, it's really lit, and also there was a competition for students at the Brown Music School to write compositions to be played at the Waterfire Festival. And each year, Brown has canals that have been restored. They were roads and they've been reverted to canals throughout the city. And the Waterfire Festival is more or less every second week with braziers in the water that are lit, and then boats that have got lit sails that are fish-like shapes and so on, and music everywhere. And it's a great event to bring people out. So every night, for every second Saturday for about 6 months, people come out, but they've never collaborated with Brown. So we got the music students, including many very fine composers, to be involved in that. Last year was Water's Edge, and Water's Edge was water, mouth, text. Given that mouths are watery, and drinking water and everything else. And what I was interested in this was the way in which text is able to capture things about an element, and what are the dimensions of writing around water. And as you'll see on the right hand, we had 2 seminars called Writing on Water with some of America's most interesting environmental poets. And one of the things I did actually last weekend before coming here was get this off to the press with my co-editor, which includes essays, memoir, poetry, and then some photography and some sketchings as well. Now remember that in addition to this, there are, in this case, 4, I think, afternoon panels on water and its management and its knowability, roughly grouped into one on what's liquid solid, where we were looking at ice and water, and is ice water or land, and how does the edge of Earth change in that process. The other one was on passageways and movement, which is also around migration, but of course passageway is an interesting way to think around things like estuaries and what happens with estuaries with silting up and changes that are therefore imposed on species. And also of course there was the video with the soundtrack you heard, and the library and the flash lectures and so on that added value to this. And again, it was a 2-week program. When I took up the work at Brown, I concurrently took up work which is 6 months a year for as long as I choose to do it, so for as long as I can, at Johannesburg at the University of Witwatersrand. And the idea was that I would do one of these programs in South Africa. Now I chose not to do that because I didn't want to break continuity at Brown, so I did one extra as well. And I want to spend the rest of the time talking about watershed and art science, and what I'm calling art science and elemental politics. This was a unique moment really. In Cape Town had been having a drought for 3 years, and at the time that we were planning watershed, there was almost no water. So people that I knew were bathing once a week and otherwise washing their faces and the faces of their kids. Now that meant academics, people living in the poorer parts of Cape Town, had even less water. So it was dire, and the discussion was, oh, well, we just chuck, well, they were doing some desalination building, but desalination doesn't happen overnight. And at the same time, there were discussions about trucking in water. At the same time, a number of people in the richer suburbs on the ocean side of Table Mountain were drilling their own boreholes so they had water, which is problematic, because if you access groundwater, you reduce groundwater for everybody else. Boreholes are not a long-term solution, and that gave rise to what colleagues of mine refer to as the borehole bourgeoisie. So we now have the borehole bourgeoisie who have no problems with water, and people living in the sandy areas of the Cape Flats, many of whom are desperately, desperately poor, who already do things like share one toilet per 50 people and one tap for 50 people, being stripped of water. The drought broke more or less in July, and so and then it did rain fairly steadily, and it was the first winter rain for 3 years, so it was desperately needed, and it did resolve the problem. Having said that, everybody focused on Cape Town because it is where all the tourist dollars come into the country, and people tend to come to Cape Town and get all excited by how beautiful it is, and then go up to Kruger and look at the animals, and that's what they think South Africa is about. But other parts of the country are still in drought, and the one that struck me, and I'll introduce you to her in a moment, is a colleague of mine and friend who's an artist, is at Rhodes University, what is still currently known as Rhodes University, in a town called Makanda, which used to be known as Grahamstown. I remember I'm speaking about a period of great political transformation also. Rhodes has less than 10% water left in the dams, and at that point, what you actually get in dams is undrinkable brown sludge. The university is 80% with no water. The town's a bit smaller than probably than Exeter, but if you can just imagine this university, what that really means is no biology, no wet labs of any kind, as well as no art. Toilets that aren't working, the garbage collectors are on strike, so there's also no garbage being collected. And Grahamstown is in serious problems because it's also the home for the National Annual Arts Festival. So think Edinburgh translated to South Africa. No one wants to go there in the middle of winter with no water and try and camp when sometimes hot water is the way you get warm. In any case, the point about watershed is the University of Witwatersrand is on the watershed, and the watershed is the point at which the water falls off. And on one side of the watershed, the water runs into the Yuskai and then the Orange River out into the Atlantic, and on the other side it goes into the Limpopo and then out into the Indian Ocean. So it's on a watershed, but given what I've said about drought, and what I haven't said yet, but it's not irrelevant, about hydroelectricity and the crisis of electricity in the country, such as over this last weekend having no power for 8 hours, then there's a watershed politically. And I think that globally the crisis means there's watershed moments all the time. So we use that as a way to capture both the geography. The high point of the watershed is at the Origins Museum on campus, which is where we had some of the exhibitions and research. The photo you're looking at I'll come back to later, but it's by Atul Bala, who is one of India's great contemporary conceptual artists. Right. This work was done by Brian House, who's a young artist who I originally worked with at Brown when I was doing atmospheres. So he's a sound artist. And he did this work while he was in South Africa, collaborating with the Department of Chemistry, actually, and some people working on water, and then installed this at a digital arts precinct called Shimolohong precinct for the Fakagesi Festival, which is a digital art festival. The point is that what you're looking at are big chemistry bottles, and in the bottles is what's called acid mine drainage. That is the rubbish water off mines, which is highly toxic with heavy metals. And the speakers, which you got from various second-hand shops, allow the output of the degradation or the changes in the water over time. So you get this sort of molecular vibration, and you can therefore hear changes in the water with the heavy metals. And he's done a lot of that kind of experimental work. This was really remarkable. The one thing that he'd hoped, and again, this is a big installation, he had hoped to do was that the water would change colour over time, and it was up for a month, and it didn't change that much, which meant that there wasn't much changes going on other than the oscillations of the molecules in the water themselves. This work, which was gifted, and then the artist received some funds from it, by the Wits Art Museum. This is a work called Below the Sediments, and the artist who you can see speaking is Christine Dixon. So one of the things we did for Watershed, I mean, the main focus was on water justice and water insecurity, and those were the immediate moments. And very conveniently, the day we opened Watershed, at which point Christine was talking to people about her work, all water was cut on campus for the rest of the day. So everyone got a really immersive experience in not having any flush toilets or water coming out of taps. Not organised by me, but I do my best. The lines, you can see these bluish lines, and basically what the work is print, enlarged print, tinted on brushed steel as one layer. and behind the layer is polymer printed with the images of water, and then the drill lines are the fracking lines. So, and as you can see from Christine's About My Size, this is the artist who's in Makunda dealing with a campus with no water at present. So the work got printed and then brought up to South Africa. And the space we were using was the Origin Centre, and remember, some of the oldest human and humanoid remains are just outside of Johannesburg. So the Origin Centre was actually, and had a huge gallery upstairs that we took over for some of this work. So, and all artists talk to their work. So for those people who said this is a close-up detail of it, so you can see how in the design of the printing, the earth is shattered, so there are cracked lines, and then there are the channels through which water is pumped to fracture the earth to release gas. And then there are the images at the bottom. So in addition to that, we had, so in the end we had 15 artists. So I'm not going to take you through all the artists, but 15 artists involved from South Africa, Peru, United States and India. We had 4 full half days of panels and seminars and so on, keynote lectures, a very big reception with a whole group of students from the dance department performing there. We had poetry readings, book launches and a whole lot of other things. And what has been interesting has been the way in which people like the electrical engineering department and others got excited, the whole Faculty of Science, which actually was not represented in any of the sessions, simply, you know, took the top off their budget for us. So, I mean, there was great generosity. The other thing about it was the way in which this approach captured a public imagination. And in 40 odd years in Australia, I have never got the access to media that I had here. So, for example, I had every major newspaper in the country carry stories with my byline, which was nice, which was based on a thing I did for a sort of a core media thing called 360 Degrees, and other people can pick it up, but they picked it up very honestly, you know, under headlines, you know, watershed moment. I had 10-minute interviews on prime time radio, like drive time radio, which, I mean, in Australia, you'd bribe for that amount of exposure, I suspect. And I didn't have to. I mean, this was just extraordinary in terms of that kind of uptake. And this is when I make all academics truly jealous. I did an article for the Conversation Africa, and we have Conversation UK here, I know. And so this is, for those of you who don't know it, you can only do it usually if you are an academic and ideally with a PhD, and it's like a short research report, 800 words more or less. And so I did one around climate change and the environment for the Conversation Africa. What I did realise is that other people can reprint it once it's done. And I have published in Plumbing Africa Online. And between an article on leaking taps and an article on new pumps, and so I'm now a household name probably amongst the publishers in the entire continent. So this piece of work is work by a Peruvian artist called Lucia Monge, who's actually shown and work and done performance art in London also. And the inspiration from this, which is what I'm showing you do, is actually plant adaptation in desert conditions. So the far west of Western Cape and Northern Cape towards Namibia especially, plants are designed to survive in very, very harsh conditions. For example, the thorns are in lieu of leaves, so that the thorns are functional. They're not protecting the plant from being eaten. They're actually allowing the absorption and collection of water. So there are all these plants that have got little catchment areas on them. So this was around that, and then the little clay things at the bottom are minute, as you can see. Right. Okay. I'm these little are reflecting water collectors, right? I mean, and they're just all handmade. So that's Lucia. Mark Lewis, this work is of water staining on rocks in far north South Africa near the Swazi border. And it's simply that over time you get these marks, and it is where water's dried up. And so these are actually all single pieces of works, and they're photographs. So we framed 16 photographs to show that. The next piece, these are made from found wood and, you know, recycled pieces of wood, and they're hyenas. The point about a hyena is that hyenas track along water courses. So they're water-friendly animals, I guess. It's, I mean, all animals go to water holes to drink, but hyenas stay close to the waterline. And the artist who did this, Hanley Kutsia, is the person who did the Eland and Bento fire in performance installation kind of piece at the Nairock Sculpture Park that I showed very early on. So, and these animals are more or less the same size as hyenas are in the wild. So there's sort of something very powerful. What Hanley then decided to do was to take the hyenas for an early morning walk with her brother. And she did so now. Okay. Oh, clever. So I just want to show you this because it's a very short. Okay. So she took the dingoes for a little walk about 8 o'clock in the morning, and there was only her and her brother. Oh dear, it's buffering slowly. And if it doesn't hurry up, we're going to skip it. But he used stop frame animation, so it actually creates the illusion of these little hyenas scooting off and following students. Never mind, I think we'll just keep going. So that's terribly sad, but this is something, and oh no, sorry, there we go. Oh, very nice. And we had this on a monitor behind where the hyenas were, which was sort of just near Mark Lewis's work, and Lucia Monge and Christine Dixie's work. And so the hyenas were there, and then you could watch this on a monitor. And so, and that was simply born, and you know, the idea was simply how do I stop it?
That's it.
Oh.
Let's go to the next screen.
Right. Okay. There was a number of there were a number of interventions by performance artists. This is a man called Manohar Tool, or rather a man inside the costume. And both Maya and Hanley actually took people on walks. So in addition to the formal seminars and everything else, there were some nice things that people did. And Maya actually, Hanley walked people along the watershed, which is where those hyenas were playing, which is right outside the Origin Centre and the engineering building on campus. And one of the things this did was brought together the East and West campus, that is arts, humanities, and applied science and law and management together. So it was really interesting in that respect. Maya's also is a playwright and actor. This was my big win. This is the conceptual artist Atul Bala, whose visual was was used for the poster. And where this is in the atrium of the engineering building. So it's the old the Chamber of Mines, and then the modern offices and classrooms and everything are in wings off this huge atrium with this massive vault ceiling. And then there is a mezzanine level, which you can sort of see in the picture if you know what you're looking for. And the mezzanine we use for the dance performance and the reception of the keynote and so on. In the bowels of this building it's called a digital mine. It doesn't look very digital, but it is like a simulation of a mine for mining students to get to learn some things like mining safety, rather than going down a mine and discovering it the hard way, because they're not very safe. The central, see where that person is, and straight ahead there's some metal-looking things. Those are used by what are called zamazama, and zamazama are people mining old mine shafts that still have gold in them, and they're largely young men from Zimbabwe and other immigrant and unemployed, and vulnerable people who are coming in and working these mines. How do you get gold underground in a disused mine? The mines, it's deep mining, they go down like usually 2 kilometres, sometimes much further, and the earth stands up because of pillars, right? So there's the earth's surface, and then there are pillars holding earth up with houses on top of them, and then you go down a couple of kilometres to get to the mine. But what is there to mine if it's already been mined? The pillars. So it's dangerous, and there are lots of accidents. But it also trashes the environment, and I showed you earlier those chemistry bottles with heavy metal in them, and all around the mines are just acres of red water lying around that is toxic. So what our tool did work with the zamazama, explored them. The printy thing at the back, that brown and white, is actually huge prints, and there were like 18 prints, and the ceiling was like half the time high again as this, of what the earth looks like around the mine. So the entire atrium was surrounded by these curtains, and then with the panduka that the miners use in the centre, which is what they put the gold in to bring upstairs, and then his photographs that were part of it. And I'll just show you. So one of these you've seen because it was on the poster that I showed you earlier. And so each of these images was there in addition to some other work of his. Here's another shot of the screens, and the spiky thing you can look at is what keeps people out of buildings and yards. So this is sort of an image to the securitisation of the middle class. The really lovely thing is that you will see that everything is in black, and it was originally grey and red, and the Dean of Engineering said, you can paint it, I don't care, that's lovely. So we painted the building, and it fundamentally changed people. Students walked through there every day for over a month. The person who runs the digital mine became our greatest fan and has taken stuff in custody for Atul. The black and yellow are text pieces that Atul had translated in Zulu, so there's Zulu and English, but it says things like residue flow reflected, black drained red, and so they're like, I mean, it's a poem that he broke up as bumper stickers. So there's multiple interventions for this, and there was originally some outside, except it proved to be a slight risk. The final piece of work I want to show you is, in fact, what happened on closing nights, so opening night. So this is the close of the lecture, but this is opening night for Watershed. And what happened is that this performance piece, and I'm going to show you a very tiny bit of it, was live streamed into the reception as it was happening, and live streamed to Brown and then through the US. But anybody in the world could have watched it. So that was really quite wonderful. So again, this is a performance artist, and you can see him behind it, so you know how big this clear plastic ball was, and it had his slightly less than his body weight of water in it. Actually, well, you can see the water at the bottom, it's not. It's actually probably half his body weight, because in experimenting he couldn't push his body weight in water up a hill. So it starts at the bottom of the hill where cars come into campus and goes right up to the watershed, and we are meeting in the watershed. I mean, in the building at the top, which is the engineering building where Atul's work is. And what he's simply doing is pushing the water up. Now, the point about that is, and we mightn't be able to get this, no. Let me just see if I can get it. Oh. Maybe not.
I'll give it a go.
Right, you give it a, whoops. I don't know what I've done now. Yes, sorry, I've taken it. In any case, what happens is that it's dusk, and by the time it gets to the top of the hill, it's dark. It takes about 18 minutes, and I'm not sure what okay, sorry, Anne. And he's pushing it up the hill. It has a leak. So as he goes uphill, it lightens. But what happens with a ball, if you've got a leak, it gets harder and you can't roll it. And so it takes about 20 minutes to go up this hill as it's getting very dark. And oh, wonderful. No, sorry, just stopped. And by the time he's 3/4 up, it's still got water in it. And can you see if you can find the thing so he can skip along? Although it can just sit there and people can look at it because there's no sound. Anyway, what then happens is that by the time he gets nearly to the top, it's flat and he has to drag it and pull it. And by the time he does get to the top, he's in tears with frustration. And it's very obvious what this work is about in terms of pushing things uphill at leak. And the Sisyphean task of dealing with climate change and demands on the earth and air and water and fire, indeed, in South Africa. So it just captures quite extraordinarily. I mean, you can see the effort in this. It's watching it through is sort of painful. In any case, this is where I want to end it. And really the point was to just showcase what I've been doing for the last several years while I think about how to write it up in an intelligent way. Thank you.
Lenore, thank you very, very much. I mean, in many ways, deeply inspirational because of some of our interests here, some of our commitment both to working across disciplinary boundaries, but also in very innovative ways. So this is absolutely fantastic to see. We have some time for some questions, if you would be happy to answer.
I'm certainly happy.
It's a pretty basic question, but what's your favourite artwork that's come out of all these pieces? Because I think they're all wonderful.
Yeah, it's not that simple. The better question is, I mean, the one I got the most fun out of, not fun, because the brown I had a bit of logistic support. This one I largely put together by myself, so it was absolutely no fun at one point. Increasingly I like this piece we're looking at. Some of the people, Christine Dixie is a very good friend of mine whose work is in the Smithsonian, and I have enormous respect for her work. And I did like that piece. All those pieces. I think Henry is fabulous. I'm now supervising her for a master's in a centre on climate change. So she went from being a conceptual and artist and mural maker to doing a thesis. The one I liked most because it really pushed me was probably atmospheres, because air is a really hard thing to think about. I mean, water you can apprehend, you can touch it, you can swallow it, you can bathe in it and everything else, duck out of it. See, it's getting flat now. Whereas air we just take for granted. And the work of the acoustic ecologist I found really inspirational. I didn't necessarily like all their work, but I love what they're doing. And I did put together a special issue of Contemporary Music Review, which someone probably my brothers were all laughing themselves sick at the thought that I would lose anything on music, because that's not a strength of mine. But it was really interesting to think, well, what is the role of a musician in dealing with environment and climate change? But water, the person I'm working with for this book has just been fabulous to work with. But others had other things going. The fire performance and working with Risky was exciting, and to get the town on board. And again, there's one coming up in a couple of weeks called Blue Sky, which is subtitled Agility and the Possible in a Warming World. And in that context, we're working with all kinds of people working at a local level, doing interventions and really pushing what is the relationship between global governments and local innovation, and worrying away, but also looking at planetary sciences. And the starting point for that was actually that it started actually, so Stephen Hawkins, when he was alive obviously, said that one ought to really support space research, because what if we can't stay here anymore, we can go somewhere else, words to that effect. And people like Elon Musk and Richard Branson still maintain that illusion that it's not just Earth that's there for plundering, but pretty well anywhere else in the galaxy. And so I took that as a kind of starting point, but really what we're looking at is species adaptation and human adaptation, and why little interventions matter as much as big interventions, and particularly when you can't rely on the big. And the point is actually to end up somewhat inspirational, and there we're using visual arts and having a bigger film festival than normal, because of the way in which imagining the possible and finding narratives for a possible that is optimistic, is what happens all the time in speculative fiction and science fiction films and so on. And that's a winded way of, I just think they're all fabulous, actually. Shura is a magic dancer. If you know your dad's history, she is so like her father. If anyone doesn't know their dad's history, her father's Mikhail Baryshnikov, who is the world's greatest male dancer alive. And working with this woman was, it was so intimidating.
David.
So thank you for your talk. I want to ask you, I'm a scientist by background, but I've always been more than sympathetic to if you like, humanities and the arts. Partly because I think this is an emotional journey as much as a rational journey. Partly because I've seen the great failure and narrow-mindedness of scientists in engaging people, public policymakers. The question I've been wanting to ask you while listening to you is there a danger that by taking a humanities and artist approach to it, the consequence is counterproductive, in the sense that many people see art as beautiful and aesthetic? There's a risk that we normalise a catastrophic change rather than inspiring anger and activism and action. That may seem a very simplistic question, but I take people to installations, as you've shown, and hoping to activate them and to show them that this is a real thing happening on our watch. And I'm deeply disappointed by them saying it's interesting, it's beautiful, it's stimulating, because that's not quite the reaction I'm really encouraging.
And I think that's a very interesting question, because that's Julie's Bicycle's precept, is that you inspire and activate people through art, and that is the perception I would use. And David Buckland in Cape Farewell, who in fact had sponsored various, as I said, he was involved in COP21, has worked from that premise also. But in answering that, and it was really your preface when my heart slightly sank, because I on Monday had a meeting, because although I'm not doing any more at Brown, in 2020 we're doing a thing called Peak 2020 FITS, and it's across campus in energy and power. And there's an African energy leadership centre, and the person came with a background in business and started off by saying, I don't see the point of anything arty. And then it sort of deteriorated from that, but, you know, we were wasting time and what we needed was evidence, and what about, you know, the people who funded him, who were the coal people, because yes, there wasn't enough hydroelectricity, so back to coal, and you just sort of like, I mean, where is this person? And the interesting thing was, I mean, the university, meaning the central administration who were doing fundraising for me, just said, well, you know, that's an interesting point. He's not alone, of course, and I also had a colleague who was involved in Watershed, who at one of the big round tables that we were wrapping up with in IBM Research Africa said, you know, the problem for him is he doesn't really understand art, he just knows what he likes. And one of the artists who I work with very closely said, I know exactly what you mean, because I don't understand science, but I know what But I mean, what I am trying to do is inspire, and I think a lot of these are inspirational. And the interesting thing is, the person who did the hyenas is now working with climate scientists with the city of Johannesburg towards some clearing up and things. So it translated directly into action. I'm not necessarily concerned to you know, that it's going to translate that quickly. What I think it does is keep the issue on the agenda, and Australia and America are two of the countries that have tried to push climate change off the agenda. And, you know, I worked with colleagues in 2011-12 to do a big report for the Academy of Science of Australia on climate sustainability and population. And I have watched all of their work being picked apart and taken back by a government that is, you know, amongst the most retrogressive that I can think of. And, you know, I mean, it's frightening, and I think one does have to keep on pushing it different ways. There's an extraordinary mass of artists doing this kind of work and other work, which you know, I think does feed into thinking around, well, what sorts of changes are involved, and how do we move it? And, you know, things have changed. You know, for me, the most inspiring, when we first talked about climate change, not when we first talked about it, but even 5 or 10 years ago, people would say, well, it's not feasible because the developing countries, you know, China and India, etc., won't play nicely because they've got to develop. So this is a problem we will pick up after development has come in their dreams. And what I find most interesting has been the innovations and the policies and programs in countries like India and South Africa. And they are seriously thinking about it. They're not interested in a kind of, oh, well, we won't be here, or we'll just go to Mars or somewhere and plunder their, you know, material. South Africa, including provincial governments, have got solar farms and wind farms, and of course the crisis with the Electricity Commission. I mean, Lesotho sells its water to South Africa as hydro, you know, electricity. Water from Zimbabwe, I mean, it's outrageous. So, but in order to fuel an industrialised country, where does the electricity come from? And increasingly it's gone to renewables, but in that space there has been so much happening in the small for-profits and everything else. India has done, I mean, there are a whole lot of industries that are part of a consortium about environmental management and protection. So places like Manipur and that area in India, that's the Myanmar side of Bangladesh, has got huge amounts of areas that are protected, and there is an active concern about not trashing the environment. And you know, artists have been involved in all of those things, and I just think one keeps on working and supporting it in different ways. And some people are not going to read Nature or Science or even National Geographic, and National Geographics, they would see, are always about 25 years out of date and boring. But, you know, this kind of thing, I mean, the numbers of people that came to this are really interesting, and the shifts, and, you know, people are sort of actively, notwithstanding, you know, the business person who thought it was too arty. Nobody else needed to be convinced it was just a good thing to do. And I think the rest of it is that it is about climate change and it is about the environment, but the rest of it is around finding new ways to think about just about anything and bringing together disciplines rather than hardening the silos is a good thing also.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, that was fascinating. I also got a background in science, I used to work for the Met Office, partly on the impact of the environment on human health. And of course the environment does have an impact on human health and access to green space, blue space has an effect on human health. More recently, I've been teaching on a medical humanities unit to fourth year medical students at the medical school here. And it's about using all sorts of different humanities. I'm using conceptual arts, teach them to have a broader understanding of treating the whole human, if you like, that's not. And it's been incredibly heartening. And I wondered whether you'd worked with any medics.
Well, I've worked with medics for 42 years in Australia and I was still in the medical school.
Approach.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. No, I mean, I spent, as a day job when I was teaching, not much medics. It was more around cultural competence and immigration and fighting some old battles with hospitals around things like that, rather than getting them to engage. There were others at that stage who were doing medical humanities. But you raise an interesting question because it goes back to your question, which is that for me, the difficulty in the 80s and 90s when I was teaching med students was the arguments, not so much of med students sitting there rolling their eyes and me having to say, if you want to make a salary, maintain your clinic and have enough patients, you need to understand this, because just talking about culture and conceptions of health was going to go nowhere, right? And always bringing it back to the practical. And to some extent, the arguments around why do we have to learn about culture and human society when all we're interested in is anatomy and pathogens and what prescriptions, or now they don't even need to do that, they just need to have a good Google, a stable connection. But those arguments are a little bit like the arguments of a scientist or a business leader funded by the coal industry who says, I don't get the point about. And I think it is about, I did spend most of my career until fairly recently arguing why qualitative research was as valid as quantitative. And again, it's the same argument. People are threatened by disciplinary developments. But if you have people who are captured by it, I think that's really interesting. And I was telling Virginia earlier today that Virginia Thomas, that one of the things for me that's interesting is, in fact, that whilst there is a core who don't get it, one of the people I do teach on biodiversity into an executive MBA, which is a weird place for me to teach. And I teach on biodiversity and climate change, and I have never had a student in any way do anything but grab what was being taught and run with it, and they have to come up with interventions. And I do think, that group of people are 35 to 45, top of middle management leaders, and they don't even need to be convinced. What they want to do is to see other things, and they go to art exhibitions, they support artists, they have corporate social and environmental responsibility programs where they're investing in this kind of thing, and they're investing in it because they are convinced that it's important as a way of convincing others to introduce policies and programs that matter.
Thank you. I thought it was really fascinating, and it was just wonderful to see this range of different responses that I think really ran this gamut of kind of emotional and political investments. A lot of them, maybe it was partly because that one of them, or at least what was happening at Brown, was happening at the university space, and I felt like the artist group were responsible to working in that interstitial environment between, like consciously working between arts and science. And you started off talking about Eduardo Kohn and ontologies of nature and how to expand that. And I wasn't sure if I saw necessarily, although now that I'm thinking maybe about the crochet, maybe came closest to it,
Yes.
that kind of, that critical, there was a lot about working upon, let's say, the existing kind of material that makes up, and then making small adjustments to that, whether or not that's, expanding a range of sensory engagement. I didn't see that exploding or reframing or stepping outside of given topographies or ontologies of nature.
No, and it's not necessarily so in a lot of this work. I mean, I think that people are, well, they're using particular medium that they're comfortable with, and making commentaries. And the point is to, also to make art that's accessible to others. But I did want to say something related to that, which is at Brown, it was art and science, but it's not, they're not natural allies for everybody. But remember what we're looking at now, and most of what I spoke about for the last third or maybe half was watershed at Johannesburg. And that's a very different environment. And it's an environment which is deeply traditional in terms of disciplines and campuses and sciences and understandings. It is located in a poor part of downtown, by no means the poorest, but there are students on campus who come, who are hungry, so there are food programs on campus for students. There are people who always are dealing with no water and so that the stuff of everyday lives is constantly being part of what we do and how we think about the world. As I said, always. I mean, this week there were water cuts, there were electricity cuts, but the people that we had at this program, Watershed, included people from the city of Johannesburg municipality, people from the National Department of Science and Technology, people from the provincial department, from regional observatories, business leaders, NGOs and others. So it was actually a much stronger reach out, and the last one that I'll do at Brown, similarly, we're bringing in much more people. And I think, the dilemma for any of this is what can you do? Now, that's part of the answer. The rest of the answer is my thinking is evolving with this, and I need to pick that up. And what I was doing was just trying to frame how I was beginning to think about some of this.
I think you can have one more question, and then I think.
And you can see, meanwhile, that Marcus is now deeply distressed and saying, go away to Christo with the camera, and in a moment he's just going to give up. Yes.
If you're happy with one more question before we finish. Thank you.
Simple question, thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. About the elemental and the political. So the elemental politics was one of the subtitles. And
Yes.
I wonder if you can
Science and
elaborate.
elemental politics. Well, it was really around and a way of capturing the fact that all of Watershed was actually political, and it was about the elements. So it wasn't elemental meaning foundational, but it can be, but also about the elements and the fact that one cannot take for granted any of the elements in the context of South Africa. I mean, and that does relate to both the way in which the country relates to its neighbours and including in relation to their natural resources and who owns, e.g. who owns the water and the ways in which water is sold. South Africa has all of these little mono industries and which are all looking like they're going to have to break up and be privatised because the state government, the state, capital S state, can't manage it, and so it was deeply political, as is everyday life there, and questions of justice, which just continually reiterated. To some extent, the art stayed truer to the original concern to be looking at nature. The actual conversations were around the politics of it.
Well, thank you very much indeed. There is much for us to learn, I think, as we develop as a centre, which is fantastic. I think there is much for us to be inspired by. I think your arguments about the place, the value. We worry about evidence. We worry about what will make a difference. We worry about how we can impact on science and policymakers, but the ways in which this enables us to think differently, to rethink in some ways, is fantastic. And I think there are real opportunities for us to learn from you, which is why it's so nice that you're here for the next 2 days, because we can make the most of your presence in the centre. But for now, for this, thank you very much indeed.